especially today, and smiling faces. I am Susan Wachter. I am co-director of Penn IUR, and it's my great pleasure on behalf of Penn IUR to welcome you all to Penn and today's convening. Today's convening is in honor of our good friend and former Penn IUR board member, Jeremy Nowak. Jeremy, in his life and his work, embodied wisdom for the goal of urban inclusivity. But today we'll hear the rest of the story. The women behind bringing Jeremy to this great task, and the woman whose inspirational leadership inspires us today. And it is also our great pleasure to be convening this with our good partners, the Reinvestment Fund, who have been our partners in doing these series of convenings for 7 years, and we look for another good 7 years at least going forward. And with the esteemed President and CEO of the Reinvestment Fund, Don Hinkle-Brown. Don?
Apparently law professors are very short. Or they sit. Welcome, everybody. It's so great to do this in person after so many years. It really changes things to see everyone. It's like someone said it's like a high school reunion. So first, I want to congratulate Penn IUR on their 20th anniversary. We'll let you know how it feels on your 40th anniversary, because this year is our 40th anniversary, and that is a long time. There's a lot of organizations right now in our field experiencing their 40th anniversary, because a lot of us were all born at the exact same time. And our guests will tell you a little bit about that time. It was a very unique time. I'd like to thank Wendell Pritchett and the law school for the use of the lecture space. Thank you very much. And I'd like to especially thank Penn IUR and the Reinvestment Fund staff. I should be able to say that, right? For supporting the event, for volunteering and helping us get this off the ground, because this was entirely different than doing a webinar like we've done for the last few years. Thank you, Ira, for shepherding us through this year after year, and your dedication to the And if Zoe Milstein is here, I'd love to introduce our Jeremy Nowak Fellow. So there's two ways that we have institutionalized remembering and reflecting on Jeremy's influence. One is this event, and the other is to create a gap year opportunity at the Reinvestment Fund for a fellow. And you are our third fellow. We had some stay over, so kind of our fourth or fifth year, but you're our third fellow. That's great. I would like to introduce, but not go into bios, Pat Smith, who was our co-chair on our founding board, Joyce Wilkerson, and Eva Gladstein, our other co-chair of our founding board, who will be talking to you. And Kathy O'Regan is a board member of the Reinvestment Fund, and academia under stress in these days.
Everybody's under stress.
Everybody's under stress these days. But I invite them to come up, and thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Terrific. Great. Thank you. So good to see you all here. This is terrific. I'm glad it's a good reminder we're getting to do this again in person, which we haven't in a while. Thank Penn for letting us host here, and it's good to see. I've just watched the reunion of many, many people who've been involved in the Reinvestment Fund and the broader movement. So I want to dive into the panel here. So I just finished teaching my community and development course, and in that class, every policy that we look at, I say we have to start at the beginning. We have to go back to what was the problem people thought they were solving at that time, what was the broader context, both the constraints and the opportunities, and then who were the players. That's what this panel is. We get to do this today, really thinking about Reinvestment Fund's origin story and honoring the whole set of folks, three of whom are on the panel today, who shaped its creation and brought Jeremy in to this work. And so this is really a story both about Reinvestment Fund and the mission finance area and its development. So a little bit on structure, what we're gonna do is we're gonna having a moderated conversation, probably about 45 minutes or so, and opening it up for questions. And so we'll have questions here from folks in the audience, and those of you online will be able to send your questions in through the Q&A function. Terrific. So the starting point, first, to go to the beginning, I want to start even before you banded together to understand who you are and let the audience know what were you working on at the time as you came together, before you came together, and what did you care about? So give you a chance to do a better job than I would do on reading out your bios. And maybe we'll just go down the line.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and so happy to be here and see so many great faces. At the time that we founded the Delaware Valley Community Reinvestment Fund, I was the director of the Tenants Action Group and had been doing that work since the mid-70s. And these two ladies, as legal services lawyers, had represented our organization, Tenants Action Group, in multiple efforts. And then I think we can get a little bit more into the timing, but for me, this was an outgrowth of my membership on the board of directors of Bread and Roses Community Fund, which had been established in the 70s. And I was a member of that board, and really a lot of the early thinking came from that board, where they had mission-driven social and economic justice folks who had some money, who were making investments, and they were giving out grants. And the thinking then was, is there a way to use this money over and over and over again through a loan fund? Is this a good time to share? There were some other people who were...
I'm going to go down the line and then we'll do that.
Okay, that's fine. Anyway, so I was really happy to be part of that transition from Bread and Roses Community Fund to creating a loan fund and what that meant. And I'll say one other thing though, which was we had begun at the Tenants Action Group, and people might not think about this, to get very involved in looking at banking practices at that time, looking at mergers, looking at the failure of banks to lend low-income and affordable housing, and had entered complaints and done some work around that with a lot of friends in the, I'll say, the economic justice community. So there was also a piece of looking at broader policy and economic infrastructure and what it meant for the people we were serving every day who were very low income, primarily women with young children.
Great.
Yeah, so hello, and I want to thank Ira and Don for pulling this convening together. It's exciting and looking forward to trips down memory lane.
We'll get lost.
Yes, I just say one start lost. So over 40 years ago, but quickly, at the moment that I walked into the room, the meeting was held in the offices of the Tenant Action Group, I think on Juniper Street. We were there in small offices. We walked in, I said there were about 10 to 12 individuals. And I was actually working for the City Council of Philadelphia at that time. I got there because in the 80s, and this may sound familiar, there was a president called Ronald Reagan who was consistently zeroing out programs, including the supporting of legal services. And caseloads kept getting redistributed. And there were two things that struck me. One, I love individual representation of clients and making their case and telling their story. I felt that there was these systemic issues that were rooted in policy. And how might I lend my skill set? So I was a staff attorney on the City Council of Philadelphia for the technical staff. And my portfolio of work was community development block grant and other related financing programs for housing and community economic development at the time. So that's what I was doing in 1984.
And so thank you so much for having me here. I came to Philadelphia in 1979, having graduated from Berkeley Law School and then practiced law in Southern California for a couple of years and moved to Philadelphia in order to work for community legal services. I specialized in public housing. And at that time, housing was really the number one political issue going on. And so I remember coming to town and Rizzo had horses lined up in front of the gallery. There was a grassroots movement to get federal dollars spent on community-related activities. And so that was really my genesis. I was working for legal services, specializing in public housing, had residents that would routinely demonstrate and get arrested because it was legal services. We couldn't do any kind of criminal work, and that's how I ended up meeting John Street, who was not an elected official. He was just a guy that would represent poor people who were getting arrested for demonstrating about housing. He and Holly McGuigan, and some of you remember Holly McGuigan, who was with the National Lawyers Guild, were the two folk who would represent our tenants. So it was very much a grassroots kind of effort, and particularly in the public housing space. You know, there were squatters taking over government offices. I mean, it was a very active time. I, at some point, decided I wanted to move away from representing consumers of affordable housing to begin representing, addressing the development side of housing. And so I ended up working at the Redevelopment Authority, where Phoebe was there, and Pat was there, and represented the authority as housing counsel, specializing in the development and issuing bonds on behalf of the Redevelopment Authority. And it's in that context that I became familiar with the Reinvestment Fund, except for Ira. I remember Ira when he was a grad student at Temple. And he was working for Dave Bartelt, right, who had this amazing database on what was going on in Philadelphia. And so that's how I came to know the Reinvestment Fund and served on the loan committee.
Okay, so Eva already mentioned this, there was a larger group of players who were involved in this effort, and so I want to take a few minutes just to shout out a few names in recognition of the broader village in this collective story.
Yeah. Well, I'll start, you'll fill in where there are gaps. So I'm going back to the room. I always call it the room, where we had our meetings. And there was Jehudi Tober. And Jehudi, I believe at that time, could have been the executive director of Southwest Community Development Corporation. I lived in their neighborhood, and I was on their board. You're going to see all the intersections of relationships as we talk. There was Rob Sanders, Sam Folene, Dick Fernandez, Reverend Dick Fernandez.
I remember that.
Yes, who was really, I think, when I think of him, I think of the anti-war movements of the 70s and his activism in that place. And I know there's some others.
So I'll add, I'll keep going. First of all, Phoebe, who's sitting right here, who co-chaired with me for some period of time. I'll forget dates. I wanted to shout out Ann Doley, who is the executive director of Bread and Roses, and was really at that board where they started with their investors thinking about what can we do. And Andy Lamas, who was also on that board and then transitioned. Roger Zepernick, yeah, which is also, because I knew Roger, I had met Roger and Jeremy actually through the same work at that time. So I got this.
And there are numerous people in this room who have connections to those early days. Maybe we'll take a moment. You want to stand for a second or just raise your hands? Whatever your moment is. Go ahead. I'll take credit. It's a collective story. I wasn't coming. I shouldn't be raising my hand. All right. Well, there'll be more stories shared as we go. So you already started to begin to lay out what the environment was like and what really spurred this. But maybe we can take a little more time on that, on what was leading up to this moment and the factors that you were trying to address that kind of motivated you to apparently spend a lot of time in that room having those meetings.
You want me to kick off?
Sure.
I think it was a convergence of many different things happening in the late 70s and in the early 80s. And it was happening both at the local as well as the national level. For me, the thing that grounded and inspired us was just the activism that was afoot, so to speak. I mean, Philly was like many post-industrial cities. It was the white flight, losing a population, we were becoming even hyper-segregated. There was redlining. All of that's been documented, over and over again. That thanks to folk like Dave Bartel, discriminatory lending practices. But there was also looking beyond just the city limits, and there was the activism that was taking place globally. And for me, it was the time of the anti-apartheid movements. Philly was in a way a center of a lot of that activism. Reverend Leon Sullivan, developed the Sullivan principles, thinking about how can corporations use their influence to change and to bring apartheid to an end with the Sullivan principles. Then there was the call for disinvestment to pull our money out. And you often ask yourself, one thing is to take your money away, but then what are you going to do with it? So I think those, when I look back, those were two sort of like intersecting things that were taking place in the city.
I think it was also interesting that the people involved were moving, between various organizations. And so, the same folk that were involved in some of the political activity were involved in like I was a legal service lawyer, Pat was a legal service lawyer, involved in organizations. There was a national conference of Black lawyers. People wore a lot of different hats, but really had overlapping relationships. And I think one of the things that we've talked about is how intense the relationships were, and relationships that have sustained over time. And so a lot of us go back decades and decades and decades and decades.
Because leave stuff after the sex.
But that ends up being, I think that ends up being really important, and so as we put on different hats and move into different positions, the relationships have been fundamental to the work that's been done. And,
Yeah. I think creating trust and kind of unity around mission is really important. Like today, we did a few things. One was the Stop Rizzo movement locally, which really, I felt like I was living in East Germantown, brought like-minded people together in a very strong, passionate way. Ultimately, it just kicked off, but anyway. But also, Reagan was elected, and we thought the world was gonna end. But we had a few years to start to figure out, okay, the world hasn't ended, what can we do? What are, again, resources were being ripped from communities. And so that's why I think there was more of a focus around banks and alternative financing at that point in time. Again, why a tenant activist was doing this was, I think that was really important, that we were kind of at the kind of side of, okay, we thought the world would end, it hasn't quite ended, we need to do something, and what are those things that we can do that'll make a difference locally? And I'll say, the movement's persisted, so Liz will actually really appreciate this, but there was a coalition of maybe 20 states that had tenants' rights organizations, and we met regularly. And then that resurgence has occurred in the last few years, but that existed in the 70s through the mid-80s. So there was a lot of movement building in the 70s and early 80s, and I think that really, to Joyce's point, created relationships that enabled us to do some very hard work, because it wasn't easy.
So I think there are a couple of themes there that we're going to be coming back to as we talk about different stages and what you were doing. And you were talking both about changes at the federal level of the retrenchment and the loss of those resources, and then specifically thinking about the work that you had done with CRA and changes in banking to think about the role of capital and alternative ways. So what you're talking about now is pivoting to capital, a capital tool that's different. So maybe we can we'll go into the details of that next. I'm thinking about the it that you were creating in that room and how you were thinking about it. And I think the discussion on relationships will come back in here. Can you describe the model? What were you trying to create in this new space? This is before CDFIs existed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and before the CDFI fund.
Yes.
I think that's important to note.
And the beginning of community development corporations where lots of, I mean, I remember watching that with dismay at first because groups that had been community associations and organizing entities started to become community development corporations where they were, like Joyce, going to redevelopment authority, starting to look at kind of taking it into their own hands and doing the development themselves. And I think I had a concern then that we kind of lose the soul and the mission and, you know, the organizing skills almost. But that's what was kind of, I think, going on right at that moment in time. So.
Yeah. As I reflect on that moment in time and thinking about the model, I think there were a couple of things that were part of our conversations. One, you know, could we convince essentially individuals and people to take their money, you know, to go into their own pockets and then invest this money in such a way that their return would be modest? Could you make that case? Could you convince people that this is not the time to have your money in big multinationals or but you wanted to make sure that your money stayed in the community in which you live. And so a lot of our thinking was, how can we make a case? What is the story? I know you're calling this the why campaign. That is important that you double the impact. You'll get a financial return, but more important, there'll be a social impact and you'll get a social return. So making that case. The other part of this, so that was a shift. I think the idea that it was a loan fund was a major paradigm shift. I mean, there historically, it was more about direct subsidies to housing. It was more about grants from the philanthropic community, you know, charitable giving. But this idea of money revolving and recycling throughout a community was very important. It was also thinking about, and how do we reach those who historically have been left out of accessing credit because of discriminatory credit practices and the like. How do you find the smaller organizations who are doing great work in their community and help support their work in financing? So that was like the second component. And then the role and the model was, you know, then DVCRF was kind of that intermediate structure of matching investment capital to and making sure it got to the places and to the people who needed it most.
I wanted to just touch on that investor story you were saying, and to connect it back to what you said about disinvestment in South Africa, and this notion that capital might actually be unattracted to something that didn't match its values. If you flip that, which I've seen in some of Jeremy's writing, is does that suggest that you can attract with a bit of a mission return?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think what we were coming to is this conversation, you know, the power of money, and can it do good, and how can it do good, and what's needed to make change. So looking at it as another tool that could be deployed in communities. And I think, you know, for me, it was also about not just, in a way, it felt like new money. In other words, no one really had paid attention to say, would you, maybe some of you in this room, I'm quite sure, were early investors in DVCRF. You know, the idea that you as an individual would contribute $1,000. I think that was the size of the promissory note at that time, to do mission-aligned work. You know, the tagline in the early days, I wouldn't do too many back in the day, but the tagline was human interest. compounded daily.
Yeah.
And so I think that
Thank
really
you,
represented. Well, they took it from us, but I remember the room when we came up with it, but he was interested, compounded daily. And that, and the motivation. But then how do you bring people together around a common cause?
So this is the perfect time then to say, at this beginning time as you were going, you're creating an organization.
Mhm.
In that context of what you were trying to do, why, explain the choice to hire Jeremy.
I'll start
Yes.
Well, first of all, I don't, we might have raised a few $100,000, I'm not sure. We had money for staff for, I think for 6 months or a year or 18 months, something, but,
It was
right.
6.
Right. Not enough money to lend out. I remember our first goal of being $1 million and then $3 million and $5 million and whatever. And so, you know, Pat will talk more about this because she was on the selection committee. I will say I knew Jeremy from doing, he was a resident in Spring Garden and he helped me establish kind of an office to do tenants' rights work with the Spanish-speaking folks living in that community, and that's how Roger Zepernick got involved as well, and others. And at the point when we hired him, he was working for a community development corporation. So he had also kind of made the transition. He was also getting his doctorate, right? Was he getting his doctorate then or whatever? So, but we had to make a decision, and I'm gonna leave it to Pat, who has better memory of that process, so.
Yeah, it was, so he was an organizer for Logan, in the Logan area. We had 2 finalists for the position. One individual actually ran a small credit union, had strong technical skills, underwriting skills. Clearly, you know, remember, we're going to be lending money, and not only lending money, but lending other people's money. Pension funds from retired nuns, you know, that was part of the investment.
A lot of the early money.
Yes, was religious and represented retired nuns and retiring nuns' pensions. So, and then you have Jeremy. And for those in the room who know Jeremy, you know he's very charismatic, very visionary, very opinionated. And so it was like almost night and day. And I think at that moment, for those of us who were on the search committee, it was kind of like, well, what do we want this organization to be about? Are we just here to take some money and make a loan? Or are we here to facilitate and advance change in community? And what does that take? And for us, it was like the innovative way he thought about issues, how he talked about very powerfully that money was an organizing tool. And you have to remember that. And later, that for Reinvestment Fund has evolved into the mantra of organized capital, organized people. You still have to be in the streets or in rooms organizing for change and systems change. It was also about capacity. So not only do we have to lend the money, but we have to do it in a way that we get the money back and hold ourselves accountable. And then data and information, decision making, how do you make your decisions? And so that while he may not have used those terms, on that day in the 1980s, you see his thinking evolve. It really came to me that he saw the bigger picture. It was more than about making loans. And then how can we, as an institution, as an organization, play a role in making change in society?
Fantastic. So I want to go back. You said something a little bit earlier that's come up a couple times, which is that your source of capital was so different at the start, what you were aiming for. And you talked a lot about the importance of the role of the individual investor. So maybe I could hear a little more about that.
Yeah, it actually was the two major investors in the 80s were religious institutions, primarily various sisters of St. Francis. I understand there's a new documentary out talking about their charitable work. Sisters of Mercy, and the like. In fact, the chair or the head of the investment committee for the board was a nun, Sister Marie Lucy. So that just, and so that's one thing I think is really important. The other part, it was individuals, some who I would imagine were of, wealth, but more important, we intentionally wanted to also attract capital from middle class, everyday working folk. Someone who, again, who wanted their money to do good and not just make a financial return. So that's why we thought the role of the individual was important. And also, in the early days, and I think probably even today, that individual investor who's making that investment has a stake in what we're doing. And they have a stake in our city and a stake in the country. So I think it was an educational opportunity as well.
So I wanted to add something, which is just that even in, when I was doing tenant organizing, recognizing the importance of always being informed by what's happening on the ground by individuals and their interests, because then they're gonna be your foundation and they're gonna support you because you're gonna change over time. In order to last, you're gonna have to change. But having that initial connection, rather than just, okay, I have a few good ideas and I'm gonna change policy, or I'm gonna change the financial structure of this instrument or that instrument. You're doing that, and if you do that without being informed, by investors, so probably every board member was an investor at that point, it really strengthens the entity itself.
So it sounds as though you're talking about two directions here. One direction, that by going to individual investors who are then vested in the mission, not just the return on their money, you've also created a group that cares about you doing well, the organization doing well, and the issues. You've got, like, I think Ira has said, Jeremy used the term of the army as things happen. But also, they're a source of information back, and they keep you in that first connected. So perhaps this may be one of the many ways in which that choice you made, Pat, of going down the activist role. I'm thinking about what investors can do, and what that is a different path than you might have taken with somebody from a banking background.
And the bankers were in the room training us. How to read, how to read those financial statements.
Yes.
Loan to value.
I imagine there was a lot of learning and training. So I'm thinking about that, on the different learnings that you had to do. I know that this was a very locally driven approach, very local. But you also, I think there was some involvement with Reinvestment Fund in the broader network of CDFIs as CDFIs were developing. You were part of the creation of what became OFN, is that right?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. In terms of the timing, it wasn't called OFN then.
No, it had several names.
There you go. You probably
Got long names, right?
You're right.
If it's a bad acronym, I know it.
National Association of Community Development Loan Funds.
or something like that.
That's why they changed their name.
Yeah. So this movement just wasn't unique to Philadelphia. There was loan funds really popping up everywhere. And sometimes the person who back in the 80s was considered the guru of this was this guy named Chuck Mathai out of Massachusetts. And I think he had a convening like around when we were getting started. I remember him coming to a retreat that we had as a board, but I also think there was this big convening where they brought, at that time, it was about 40 loan funds nationally, like us, mostly individual or institutional, religious institutional investors. So it wasn't just happening in Philly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this intention to connect with one another was rooted in, hey, do we know what we're doing? And we need to lean on one another as we figure out what we're doing. We don't want to mess up and lose the sisters' money. So I think that was this idea of collectiveness was very much at the heart of the founding of that organization. It was more of a training organization, if I remember, John, in the early.
I remember learning from folks in Vermont a lot.
Maybe it was Vermont. It was one of the New England states.
So in thinking about, you started with talking about the localism and the activism, but you also were talking about local level in reacting to federal systems. But here you're talking about also creating, the movement is not just local, it's a set of local movements that are a network. Right. So as we picture the lessons forward for, I don't know, today, when we'll get to, right, that's pulling that out. There were there any, as you were starting, was there any pushback on what you were doing on this approach?
I remember there being tension so I'm coming from a public housing, working with grassroots people, and remember there being a tension, at least for me, having intermediaries between the people in the streets and the folk doing the lending. I was concerned about losing that tension, and thought that it gave people with the resources a way out from dealing more directly with the tension. And so for me, that was really problematic. And the other thing that was going on was the financing of housing, affordable housing, was becoming more and more complex. And so it was 86 when the tax credits came in. And you ended up having that, tax credit syndications. It wasn't like we knew squatters in public housing. We didn't know tax credit syndications, but it created real splits, within what had been a more general kind of movement. And I think that's a theme that has played out over time, and maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah. So taking the first part of what you're talking about is, if you started with the backdrop of CRA that you were talking about, that you were using as a local tool, right? To change the nature of that capital relationship. And if you add an intermediary and remove that pressure, you've changed a system that what you could think of as being designed to change the way banks behave and remove that. But you've got a counter pressure with the low-income housing tax credit that you're talking about, that you could imagine arguing the need for intermediaries as things become that technical on the financing side.
And it played out it played out in a lot of ways. So you had CDCs that could not, in a very direct way, take advantage. So you have all these professionals coming in, people coming out of business school, people, you had a whole class of people that were now at the table. And I never did see, in a lot of situations, the people who were the actual consumers ever being at the table. They ended up being very much removed from what was designed to assist them.
It was at that time that the federal government retreated from actually funding affordable housing. Right, so we went to tax credits, which you said, like the transaction costs, were like insane, and people didn't know how to do it for the first, 8 years. But also Section 8. I don't know what the first year of Section 8 was, but the money is passing, the tenant never saw the money, basically, right? So I'm sitting there as a tenant activist, and all of this is either a pass-through low-income housing tax credits to investors, or pass-through to whoever's owning and managing through the Section 8 program. So again, there's this kind of removal, and it was one of the reasons I was very anxious about organizations becoming CDCs, because again, they would professionalize and gain those skills they needed to develop the housing, but, and technically the boards had to be majority from the community, but that was not always quite the case, or whatever, so losing the connection to the community.
And it became a tax program, right? Low-income tax credit programs are administered out of the IRS. They're not housing programs. And so there's been this huge withdrawal of dollars. I remember we used to get modernization money for public housing. It'd be $70 million a year. It was squandered. There's that part of it. It's stolen, but it was huge dollars, right? But there's been a complete migration from the federal government out. It's privatized, you know, a lot of what's gone on, and it's had a profound difference.
Yeah.
Impact.
Yeah, I think it was like the late 70s that Section 8 came into being, that, you know, the withdrawal of direct public subsidies into public housing and into some of the other entitlement-like programs on housing. And I think during that time frame, this issue of capacity, of not just the technical capacity of the borrower, who at the time were primarily nonprofits, not just CDCs. I mean, one of the things that was fascinating about DVCRF is that we pretty much from the beginning took a holistic approach, and it wasn't just housing. It wasn't just, many CDFIs became just housing lenders, but did arts and cultural lending and small business lending, I think even a couple of co-ops and land trust type thing. But I think what was the challenge, and I think today is still the challenge when we talk about community-led and community-driven work, is who's funding the capacity to do that work. And there was a point, I was at the redevelopment authority. I had one of those careers where I kind of like a smorgasbord, I sample a little bit here and there. So, okay, tired of redevelopment authority, what's next? Went to the Philadelphia Foundation and led this program called the Philadelphia Neighborhood Development Collaborative Program, which was a operating support program giving grants and funding technical assistance. And one of the things I did was approach the Reinvestment Fund at the time, and approached Jeremy about what can we do about the capacity. So there was this effort to say, how do we make sure that as you become more proficient at building housing using complex tools, that you don't lose your soul, you don't lose your roots in the community. What does that look like? It was called community building at the time. And then, most of the CDCs that I was funding through this program were required to go to the CDFI training. It was called the Community Development Institute, which is also, I think, some national groups, but this is strictly local, and I think we worked with about 10 to 12. I know Lamar's in the room, and the CDCs, you were also funding them, but this issue of how do you build a capacity and keep connected to community was always, at least for many of us, an important part of the conversation.
So, and thinking about that was part of the model pretty early on.
Yeah, that was the early, I can do my life in decades now. So, right in the 90s. the early 90s.
So, and thinking about the financing ecosystem that you were all in, and also this collection of movements going on, there was also another financing part of the system that was developed with LISC and Enterprise, which is a different approach. And how did you all interact with?
Ooh, lots of tension.
No big enough.
That's the marvel of test. It was, I mean, if you want to talk about a lesson learned, we were all thinking like from a deficit approach, and that the resources were limited as opposed to, an approach of abundance and can we grow the pot. And again, each organization had a little different flavor, both Enterprise and LISC being national with local entities or pieces to it. But I think part of it is we were fighting locally for the same philanthropic dollars. And Philly has, and pardon anybody in the room who's in philanthropy, but Philly is woefully underrepresented in terms of large foundations and in terms of a commitment to community development or, even justice movements. And so I think a lot of it was we were fighting for those resources, and we were jealous, and who was going to place the equity for a deal and get whatever percent. So it was not easy. I hope it's eased now, and there are people in the room who can tell us about that. But yeah.
Did the creation of the CDFI fund help with easing that a bit?
Apparently not.
I was a long-term local advisory board member for LISC as well, so I mean, there were those of us who played multiple roles here. But
Yeah, like you said, we all know each other. And I think we always try to be frank and straightforward with each other. But actually, I think with the CDFI fund, that's an interesting question. Actually, I'm gonna, Don, you have a great phrase, I use it all the time, around collaboration, where you say collaboration is the next best form of competition. So we collaborate. I think the CDFIs around the CDFI fund have come together and they collaborate and they find a common ground. But I think you're right, it's this concept of how much is there to go around? And these are natural tensions. And let me say something. If you think this work is without tension, is not without trade-offs, if you think that's not the case, or there's unintended consequences of your work, then this isn't the work for you. Because I think at the end of the day, it's messy work. Particularly if it's going to be grounded in relationships, accountability, transparency, in an environment where you really don't know what's going to happen in terms of resources to support the work. So I think that was part of the stuff that was going on. But I also think, at least for me personally, some of the saving grace were my personal relationships. Like I could call up Lamar and say, how can we work together to fund this particular CDC? How you can bring your resources and talk to the people in New York about this project. And if I was with Jeremy, I would try to pull him back. Not going after Liz. So, we're in this together, guys. So I just want to emphasize that when you ask the challenges and the pushback, it's messy work. We're running out of time.
No, we got time with this, we have time. We've got more storytelling to do, but I think this goes back to where you started with. Part of this model is being an intermediary. And the choice to be the intermediary and still be grounded, maybe to just own up to the inherent tensions that come with that. But I want to get a few more pivotal moments and lessons before we open it up to questions, and people online can start thinking about their questions. But were there some important pivotal moments? We spent a bunch of time on the 80s and 90s and some lessons learned there.
Already done. The first loan, you're the second loan officer, was Corliss?
Corliss Young.
Corliss doing loans. She was doing loans, yeah. Third staff.
So you hired an organizer to be the executive director of a financial institution, and he hired a social worker to be a lender.
And the social worker had come from organizing tenants.
That's right.
She had come from Tenants Action Group. You stole her.
Yeah.
But,
Well, for me, some of the really game-changing work has been the work to create policy, use data. And so when I think about the Reinvestment Fund and some of the really impactful work, it's around the Neighborhood Transformation Initiative. And that is an initiative where a lot of these different strands come together. And so for me, I became Mayor Street's chief of staff. And one of the things he ran on was trying to do something big in neighborhoods. We had houses that were collapsing, everybody was saying, you've got to preserve them. We sent helicopters over, and it turned out there was nothing there to preserve. And so Street, when he was running for mayor, said, well, if we take all the money we spend to, demolish and pledge it towards supporting a bond issue, we can create a big pot of money. And so he, his whole first term was based on doing something fundamental in neighborhoods. And so we decided to hire Pat Smith to run this initiative. And so I remember having a conversation with Mayor Street, and there had been a newspaper article about fences. And so he would ask, where's our neighborhood transformation? What are we gonna do about fences? At the same time, Pat was hired and getting Fs in the daily news on a weekly basis. So the press chose to literally beat up on Pat on a weekly basis, post an F on her report card. And so I've got, somebody asking about fencing strategy. Pat's getting Fs in newspapers. And then one day she says, I have something you ought to see.
Oh, the MBA, market analysis. Yeah, so again, now, left Philadelphia Foundation in DC. Remember I told you I move around a lot. Minding my business when Joyce calls. Come and talk to Mayor Street. Okay, I'll go talk to Mayor Street. I'm not interested in this. But after talking to him, there were a couple of things that he said, and then I'll get to the MBA. One of the things that struck me in our conversation was that he's bringing new money to the table. And this wasn't going to be a fight over how we redistribute all CDBG. That was a very important piece of this work. And then the second thing was that he said is that I'm the mayor of the entire city of Philadelphia. And yes, we have houses falling down in the middle of North Philadelphia, but the issue of you want to use the word blight, which you like to use the word blight, it's all over the place. And what are we going to do about it? How do we think about that? And so, of course, pick up the phone and talk to two brilliant people I know, Ira and Jeremy, and said, what are we going to do about this? And out of those conversations became a framework, not a neighborhood plan, but a framework where it was going to drive or think about how you allocate resources. It wasn't going to be take $250 million and give 25 million to each. You see, I'm not a finance person. I never was a lender, but I'm a policy person. But yeah, it's so through that conversation, what anchored the Neighborhood Transformation Mission and what we showed was our issue was vacancy, and if we didn't do something about vacancy in this moment in time, the whole city will become vacant with some very powerful images. And the second is we got money, but we need to be strategic about it. And then what is the role of government? And, government can't do it all, it shouldn't do it all, but what are its strengths and how can it take money and leverage other people's money? And out of that became the framework for the Neighborhood Transformation Initiative. But that was interesting.
It was fun. It was fundamental. I mean, it took this problem that was so pervasive and overwhelming, and gave a framework for analyzing it that was just really powerful. And so I remember bringing Pat and probably Pat, Ira, and Jeremy to meet with the mayor, and it didn't take any convincing at all. It was just so, oh my God, this is a really powerful way of thinking about what's going on in neighborhoods and the role that government ought to play. And just real proud of, I was working in New Orleans running the redevelopment authority post-Katrina. And who shows up? Ira shows up talking about NTI. It's just been really impactful work that was done.
And it became part of the city's overall operating strategy, and practice in terms of going forward. So I operated a number of other programs in the city after Pat left NTI, but other
I handed the
programs.
baton to Eva. You see a little theme going.
I know, right?
But it became a strategic framework that we could use, which really, I think, took, not that it wasn't messy, it always is, but it took what could be really, really messy with, visiting every one of 10 city council district offices and trying to negotiate how many trees, how many fences, whatever. It gave us frameworks that we could work from and make more rational decisions about investment. I wouldn't say they were completely rational, but it became practice. We did it enough, and I don't know what MBA you guys are up to, but I was at least working on the 4th or 5th, I think, for the city. Yeah, but it just became part of our practice, and we kind of developed the muscles to keep using it.
So it sounds like you started off with saying part of what motivated you in this Red and Roses was how can we use money better? It sounds as though this kind of embodies many of those principles of being able to use the money better. All right, so I know that we're getting close to when we want to open up to questions. So I want to bring us forward to today and think about, doesn't have to be exactly today. Which of the things set you off recently, but think about where the field is now, but open to others. You started with some tensions earlier in the field, but what do you see as some of the biggest needs right now? Or what do you think, if there was another round of you getting in a room and talking about designing something or think of something, what do you think you'd be working on or suggest to those who are doing it now to work on?
An activist movement, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
It's very hard. Couldn't see that one coming.
We were all at the rally last weekend, we had old people rallying.
But I think, again, that's what kind of helped birth the Reinvestment Fund back then. It took a few years, but again, we were doing this work in the late 70s, and within 10 years, within a decade, we built some structures. So I'm not sure, I can't think that far ahead about what the structures might be, but I feel like first we need the energy to do that and to be able to do that hard work.
Well, so maybe I'll take this as the last question for you all, and get ready for it, and people in the room can get ready with your questions of just, and I always, when I get the chance to do this, put my teacher hat on and say, like, what advice would you give for those joining the field now, if you have any? I just spent 2 days with admin students, and I'm advising a lot right now. I would love to take some gems and just advice to give to the next gen.
It ain't easy. It may be one. I think for me, I would say, in action, there is hope. So it gets back to that core about doing. However you're doing it, in whatever context or place you're doing it, you have to be active. Yeah, I'll just say that. So in action, there is hope.
I wouldn't be, I like to see people start out at the ground level. I think what I have seen over the years is young people coming in with skill sets that, so they know the technology, they have much more sophisticated quantitative skills than we used to have, or still have. And they parachute into organizations at the upper levels, and they are not grounded in what's going on at the ground level. So I'm doing education now, and so nobody wants to be a teacher anymore. Everybody wants to, run the school district, and they have no idea about what's going on. And I think you make different policy decisions when you're grounded in a really intimate way in what's going on. And so I would tell them, don't be afraid of that entry-level job. It's not, don't be embarrassed about it, but you'll learn a lot from it.
Great, thanks.
I'm going to steal something from Pat, which is plan for success. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is not operating from a deficit model, but always thinking about opportunity. I mean, Reinvestment Fund has reinvented itself a gazillion times. It wasn't just MBA and doing the policy work, but expanding the types of lending, working on fresh food financing, working on education facilities, childcare, et cetera, all the work you did to help with childcare, expansion of childcare in the city. And so you have to be open to opportunity, and that means you have to be thinking about preserving what you have, but at the same time, not being so scared to start something else when it makes sense.
That's terrific, great advice. We're going to open up to questions now. I reread an interview with Jeremy from several decades ago, where he said something that distinguished this movement from previous movements. The statement wasn't about what you were against. It was what you stood for. And there's a a difference in the type of energy. Both things are needed depending on what's going on, but that was something about this movement. All right, so we are opening up to Q&A. We'll take people in the room first, and Ira's gonna be writing down some questions for me. Yes.
Yes, good afternoon.
Could you identify yourself, speakers, so that we know who's speaking?
My name is Calvin Williams, and I am a 1921 zip code, North Central Philadelphia lifer, 75 plus, and conscious. Conscious, the noun, conscious, the adjective, or whatever. It is the best of times and the worst of times. This is a tale of two cities. My life experiences in 1921 has put me in contact with both of these two ladies here. They don't know, but through lived experience, I'm as closest to you. I've been associated with the mayor, John Street. He never knew me, but I know you all. The question is dealing with the investment fund. I have come from a place where, in the community, driven by the Jewish community and also the Quaker community. And I am a product of that from high school. The reason why I got involved with the investment fund is that an employer of mine, Stockton Strawbridge, Quaker, for 25 years in Center City. One of the board members I saw in things that I read around was on the board of an investment fund. So I said to myself, that has got to be a halfway decent place, whatever. And so I connect dots in my life experiences. Jeremy, I hear everyone laugh when they talk about or hints on his saltiness. I experience most of that most of the time in our conversations. No one knew we talked. No one knew those things. But through the investment fund, through my association with Jewish organizations and Quaker organizations, all of my 75 years, I've come to find that when we're telling the story, again, it depends on who's controlling the narrative. I am never, ever in the room when it's happening. Never. I get the feedback, I get everything when it comes to me and it comes to our neighborhood. I now reside in Strawberry Mansion. Our family transitioned from the east side of Broad Street, matter of fact, a connection, the John Street, for a while lived in my family's backyard in the 1300 block of Camac Street where we lived. Before it was Yorktown. We were displaced from that place to the west side of Broad Street and 2400 block of Jefferson Street. I'm saying that to say that it's connections all over the place that I have with the entire city of Philadelphia and the work that's done. And we're never at the table, lived experience, in the room when decisions are made and policies are thought about, white papers are discussed, and all of those things. We're never in the room. And so we tend to repeat the same actions and the same process over and over and over again. I'm drawn here, I don't know. The ancestors put me in places all the time, here and there, to do whatever I do. But I'm encouraging any and everyone to bring elders to the table more times than not. We don't have the graphs, we don't have the charts, we don't have that, but lived experience. We do know what works. We know what works for public education. We know what works for housing. We know it because we lived it. And that's what we bring to the table, lived experience. tap our sources. And both of the ladies here, I would stop in a minute. Seek me out. You'll be surprised how closely I am with you and know you, and you don't know that I know you personally, because we come from the same place. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Identify yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Julio Rodriguez. I'm with an immigrant rights organization. So I really appreciate all the remarks, specifically about the folks that are overlooked. And my question has to do specifically with a large segment of the population that is often overlooked and is currently under daily attacks, immigrants. CDFIs play a huge role in supporting groups, and and my question is there anything being done or any support regarding language access? Because I can go and possibly get clients, but oftentimes the CDFIs are not in a position to support those people because they don't speak a language other than English. We've seen from the federal government that the official language is English, and that means that forms are not going to be translated. There's over 136 languages spoken in this city, and unfortunately, many government right now is not being supportive either, because immigration equals we're afraid of getting our federal funds cut. This is going to be the next 4 years. So I'm really curious to hear if you know of anything that's being done or can be done to help alleviate this issue.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know, Donna, if there's, I don't wanna point a finger here, but we're, maybe you guys have something, but I'm wondering if Opportunity Finance Network or individual loan funds are doing.
I think the best news in Philadelphia lately has been the merger of Community First and Finanta. And they're our primary partner in terms of those communities and those transactions. Sorry, Finanta came out of the empowerment zone, merged with a loan fund based in Lancaster. They've now moved their headquarters to North Philadelphia. They've opened a credit union as well as having a loan fund. So that's who we would go to partner in those situations, and they're completely set up with bilingual resources in every one of their programs. They are predominantly a business lender, and then we help augment them when it's real estate, charter schools, and supermarkets and things like that. We're also launching our first bilingual ECE program. It happens to be in Montgomery County, Maryland, unfortunately. So we hope to learn from that and bake those resources into the organization writ large and learn from that and be more accessible.
Thank you.
I'm going to take two from online and then I'll come right here to you. How about that?
Okay.
One is a statement, but not a comment, but from Rex. He started and ran a CDFI in Connecticut, and Reinvestment Fund was our North Star. So you get to take that home. Another is and again, this may be others in the room, beyond the panelists, what are the next innovations we expect to see in the CDFI industry?
Ladies.
Well, one thing I think would be interesting, given the state of the markets, is to reactivating really deep investor development work at the individual level. I think could be an interesting opportunity. It may not, it may not be at the same scale, or the numbers may not, the financial resources that you bring in may not. But I think if you think of it again, money as an organizing tool, and given today, how can we, make the case and work more deeply with investors, and not just to get their money, but I think as important to get their voices. I don't know if that's a big paradigm shift, but it was something I've been thinking about.
Next.
I love these ladies. They're wonderful. I know them a little longer than I want to know them, but they're wonderful. But I'm not asking a question, more so making a statement. And I want to go back to something you said, Pat, about hope. I really think that in the world that we're living in right now, that we really need hope and we can't give up, right? And for me, listening to the three of you talk about your experiences, and listen, I'm the person that was on the other side with the population, right, that needed all of this, right? But the impact of Reaganomics, I think that what you said was that the world didn't explode or implode. And I think that living in the world of Trumponomics, that we have to have hope, right? Because it's going to be difficult, it's hard and messy. I think that the honesty of saying that it's messy, any work that involves working with people who need that type of advocacy, that type of programming and implementation and support, because they can't do it themselves, or if they can't do it themselves, they don't know how. You can tell I'm a social worker, right? Thank you. The involvement of the federal government, in particular, government as a whole, things become complex. And I think that that's another area, right, where it gets trippy. Because you might be working in a program that's going to help a community, and to Calvin's point, hey Calvin, we lived in 19121 forever. Makes it difficult for people who are the average people living in communities to become a part of it, and often get forgotten. And I experienced that, and I worked in government, and I experienced that in my own community. And the other thing that I thought was significantly important, I think Calvin was talking about it, as well as the gentleman over here, is some kind of way, as I'm looking at the reinvestment piece of it, communities, you gotta involve or have people at the table who know what it's like. Now, I know that's difficult, having tried to be a part of that, because there's a tendency to get lost in what I'm feeling and my pain in the community, and not necessarily being progressive and thinking larger. But I think that those were some significant points, and I don't want us to forget that out of all this work, which I think is phenomenal work, there's still hope.
I'm going to take the hand up, and then I'll do one from online.
David Feldman, and a former Lisker from right after Lamar's day. Thank you for this program. Thank you for all the work over the years, the three of you. And first, props to Calvin as someone who comes from 3 generations of Strawberry Mansion on my mother's side. You probably remember my grandfather's hardware store at 30th and the Ridge. So I have sort of a wonky question, being a list person. And List and Enterprise Center had their own tensions too. It's kind of a Reaganomics, Trumponomics parallel. I'm thinking back to those in the 80s, and Eva was talking about CRA. One of the disruption, for those you remember, that Reagan did is banks no longer were licensed state by state by state. They broke up in the banking system, and banks were now national, which meant they were trying to do mergers. They were trying to take opportunities of things that they had to get approval from the Federal Reserve. So the CRA was like, there was an opportunity to wield that power of them having to get approval. So I'm curious, in the disruption and everything that's happening today, what do you see as places where, because things are being redone and reorganized, there's an opportunity to jump in and how things are being redone? And I don't know, I mean, I teach housing policy at Temple, and we've been talking about the importance of state and local, stepping up, because the federal's even more so than Reagan or second Bush. We're seeing that federal is sort of abrogating its role in supporting those who need help to have a safe and decent roof over their heads. So what's the sort of state and local maybe opportunities?
I mean, you see both cities and states doing things right now around the rights of immigrants, around housing policies and protecting tenants and whatever. I think that cities and states can do. So supports that were removed can be retained. But in terms of an economic restructuring, I don't see an opportunity right now, and I think we don't know yet. I mean, right now everything's playing out in the courts, obviously, right? But I don't know that there's going to be another opportunity at that level, you know, to write those complaints about bank mergers or whatever, because it's such an anti-regulatory regime.
Let me fold this question into an addendum to that, which is from online, asking how can CDCs and CDFIs pivot to influence policy at the state and local levels? If you think about this is where the levers are gonna have to be now. It may not be that there's anything that creates opportunities there as much as thinking about the role that these types of organizations can play in influence.
So what are the holes that there's an
Yes, how do
opportunity
they
to
get,
fill?
yeah, exactly, and others may have thoughts, but that's what the question from online was.
Well, I think education probably is a big role. And transportation, right? So I think one of the as a CDFIs there, I don't know how many are in the state of Pennsylvania, for example. While I do believe that a lot of the energy historically had been, on the federal level and federal policy, there are CDFIs, including Reinvestment Fund, where it just has not probably been as visible, have done policy advocacy at the state level, particularly around when, for example, someone mentioned the Healthy Food Finance Initiative. That actually grew out of a state policy led by Representative, now Congressman Evans, where significant money was used to seed, to bring resources into Philadelphia and throughout the state. So much so it became a national model. Other people tried to replicate it. But I think, I think it's just a question of amplifying the voice. Probably, not just alone. That's the other thing, it's the advocacy part, the policy part is not done just by CDFIs. It needs to and must be done in collaboration and coalition with communities. Even, So I think that's looking for those opportunities, picking a couple of issues is another way to kind of, like I said, begin to amplify. And building those relationships in Harrisburg or in Annapolis and other places, even in, Georgia.
I know we've got sets of hands up, but I also know that we are 1 minute away from end of time, and Susan is going to make ending remarks. So some people will be sticking around for chatting, and I'm sorry for the fistful of questions I didn't get to either from online.
Yes, please do stay around and enjoy each other's companies. And I want to thank our incredible panel. This will be recorded and will be a legacy learnings that we have heard from today and be available at Penn IUR website. And also, we invite you to join us on April 25th when we will be honoring the mayor, several mayors from South Africa, as well as our own Pat Parker. So you will find information on the Penn IUR website. But in closing, I want to, besides thanking this incredible panel and thanking you, the audience, return to our gratitude to the Reinvestment Fund for all their good work over the years and for partnering with us. It's such an honor to come together every year to celebrate the memory of Jeremy Nowak. And it's my pleasure to say that with us today is his daughter, Dano Nowak. You gotta come.
His daughter.
His wife.
So long. Jeremy inspired us all and will continue to do so, as this incredible panel does as well, to have hope in action. Thank you.
Thank you.